Did you know a bear was officially enlisted as a soldier in World War II? Or that the United States developed a plan to attack Japan with millions of bats carrying tiny bombs? The story of the Second World War is usually told with humans at the center. It's about soldiers, generals, and civilians. But there was another war happening. It was a global conflict fought by all species, and animals were there on every front. They were in the skies, on the oceans, and in the trenches. They were not just mascots or passive victims. They were active participants. They were messengers, soldiers, spies, and saviors. Their stories are often strange, sometimes funny, and deeply tragic. They reveal a side of the war that we rarely see. How did a pigeon become a decorated war hero? Why did the military turn to spiders for their most advanced technology? What happens when you try to guide a missile with a chicken? These are the hidden histories of the animal warriors of World War II. Number 21. Could a spider's web guide a bomb? It sounds like something from a fantasy novel. A tiny, fragile thread, spun by a spider, used to aim the most destructive weapons of the era. You might think they used fine metal wire or precisely etched glass for the crosshairs and bomb sights and gun sights. And sometimes they did, but for the most critical instruments, the best material came from an animal many people fear. The silk of the black widow spider was the gold standard. Why a spider? And why that specific one? The silk is unbelievably strong for its thickness. It's also incredibly fine and uniform, much more so than a human hair. This meant it wouldn't obscure the target. It also had a unique property. It could withstand huge temperature changes and vibrations without snapping. A metal wire might sag or break in the cold of high altitude or during the rattle of anti-aircraft fire. Spider silk held true. This wasn't a new idea. Instrument makers had used spider silk for telescopes for a century. But the war created an unprecedented demand. The most famous application was in the Norden bombsight, a top-secret piece of American technology. It was a mechanical computer that, in theory, allowed a bombardier to drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The accuracy of this complex device depended entirely on the perfect, steady crosshairs made from spider silk. Getting the silk was a delicate and strange job. You couldn't just collect webs from the garden. You needed a single, long, unbroken strand. This led to the creation of what were essentially spider farms. One of the most famous was run by a naturalist named Nan Songer in California. She was contracted by the military to supply the precious material. Her team would capture black widow spiders. Then, they would carefully coax the spider, securing it to a small frame and gently pulling the silk from its spinnerets. The silk was then wound onto a small U-shaped holder. A single spider could produce over 100 feet of usable thread. This was a highly specialized skill, a strange mix of entomology and military logistics. The same silk was used in other optical instruments like surveyors' transits and gun scopes. Every bomb sight, every artillery piece that needed precision aiming might have had a tiny piece of an animal at its heart. The men looking through those sights probably never thought about the creature that made their work possible. They just saw a perfect thin black line hanging in space, showing them where death would fall. It's a strange thought. The path of a 500-pound bomb, a weapon of immense power, was guided by something as delicate as a spider's web. What we still don't know is staggering. How many bombing missions owed their success or failure to the quality of a single strand of silk? Did any particular spider's silk become legendary among the technicians for its perfection? What happened to the specialized skill of spider wrangling after synthetic materials like nylon replaced the need for silk? And in museums today, how many of those old bomb sites still contain the original 80-year-old web of a long-dead spider? This number 20. Did slugs save soldiers from gas? Of chemical warfare was a terrifying ghost that haunted the Second World War. The memory of mustard gas in the trenches of the first global conflict was still fresh. Every nation prepared for the possibility that gas would be used again. This meant developing better gas masks and better detection systems. Soldiers carried chemical test papers, but these were not always reliable, and they couldn't provide a constant passive warning. For that, some researchers turned to a very slow, slimy creature, the common slug. The idea came from a British scientist, Dr. Phyllis G. Rossiter, during the 1930s. She observed that slugs were incredibly sensitive to even tiny traces of mustard gas. The gas is a vesicant, meaning it blisters the skin and lungs. A human might not notice a low concentration in the air until it was too late, but a slug would react almost instantly. When exposed to mustard gas, a slug's body produces a thick layer of mucus and it contracts, trying to protect itself. Its breathing pores, called pneumostomes, would close, This visible physical reaction was a clear and unmistakable signal. The concept was developed into a real piece of equipment. The British military created a device known as the slug detector unit. It was a simple, portable box with a small tray for the slugs. Air from the outside was pumped into the box. A soldier would have to check the slugs every so often. If they were shrunken, slimy, and motionless, it was a clear warning of gas in the area. It was a low-tech solution to a high-tech problem. It didn't need batteries. It didn't need calibration. It just needed a few slugs. These detectors were planned for use in trenches, command posts, and other static positions where a constant watch for gas was necessary. While widespread use is not heavily documented, the research was serious. Manuals were printed detailing how to care for the slugs and how to interpret their reactions. The slug of choice was the Limax flavus, a common garden slug, because it was particularly sensitive. It seems absurd. In an age of radar, advanced aircraft, and secret codes, the safety of soldiers might depend on watching a slug. But the military mind is a practical one. If it works, it works. The slug was a living, breathing, self-powered sensor. It was a biological alarm system, a testament to the fact that nature had often already solved problems that human engineers were struggling with. Luckily, large-scale gas attacks did not become a feature of the European land war, so the slugs were never put to the ultimate test on the battlefield. But they were ready. They were a slimy, silent line of defense, but what don't we know about this strange chapter? Were there units dedicated to breeding and transporting slugs to the front lines? How did soldiers really feel about having to care for a box of slugs as part of their duties? Did any soldiers' lives get saved by a slug detector during a localized chemical incident that went unrecorded in major histories? And was there any research into using other animals like snails or worms for the same purpose? Number 19 were geese better than guard dogs. When you think of a guard animal, you think of a dog. A German shepherd, maybe. Growling, barking, loyal, and intimidating. You probably don't think of a goose, but during World War II, geese were taken very seriously as sentinels. They were deployed to guard some strategically important locations in Britain, and in many ways they were better than dogs. The idea is ancient. The Romans wrote about how the sacred geese of the Temple of Juno saved Rome by honking and alerting the guards to a surprise attack by the Gauls in 390 BC. The British military remembered this history. A group of geese, known as a gaggle, is a highly effective alarm system. They have incredibly sharp hearing and keen eyesight. They are also intensely territorial. They will react to a stranger or an unusual sound long before a human sentry would notice anything. Their alarm call is not a bark that could be mistaken for a stray dog. It's a loud, piercing honk that is impossible to ignore. Unlike a dog, a goose cannot be easily silenced with a piece of meat or a quiet word. They are suspicious of everyone they don't know. They are also a collective. If one goose sounds the alarm, the entire flock joins in, creating a huge racket. This made them perfect for guarding sensitive sites against saboteurs and spies. One of the most famous examples was at a whiskey distillery in Dumbarton, Scotland. The Ballantyne's whiskey bond was a huge, sprawling complex of warehouses holding millions of gallons of aging whiskey. This was a valuable asset and it needed to be protected. Instead of hiring dozens of human guards, they enlisted a flock of geese. These Scotch Watch, as they were nicknamed, patrolled the grounds. They were a feathered security force, and they did their job for decades, long after the war ended. Military installations across Britain also used them. Airfields, supply depots, and factories were all protected by geese. They were cheap to maintain, basically feeding themselves by grazing. They were fearless and utterly incorruptible. An intruder might be able to sneak past a human guard who was tired or distracted. They might be able to trick a dog. But getting past a flock of angry, honking geese without raising an alarm was nearly impossible. It was a simple, elegant, and effective security solution borrowed from the pages of ancient history. There are still so many unanswered questions. How many successful alerts were credited to geese during the war? Did the German intelligence services know about this and develop any specific tactics for bypassing goose patrols? Were there any hero geese, famous among their handlers for being particularly vigilant? And did any soldiers form the same kind of emotional bonds with their guard geese that they did with military dogs? Number 18, how did glowworms light up a war? War is often fought in the dark. Soldiers need to read maps, check orders, and operate equipment without showing a light that could attract a sniper's bullet or a mortar shell. A flashlight or even a match could be a death sentence. The solution had to be a light that was bright enough to see by up close, but too dim to be seen from a distance. The answer for some came from a small bioluminescent beetle larva, the glowworm. British soldiers discovered that the light produced by these insects was perfect for their needs. The common European glowworm, Lempiris noctiluca, is not actually a worm. It's the female of a beetle species. She emits a steady greenish light from her abdomen to attract a mate. This natural lantern was just the right brightness for a soldier in a trench or a pilot in a cockpit. The practice was simple and resourceful. Soldiers would go out into the fields and collect the glowworms, putting them into an empty jam jar or a similar container. The jar would then become a personal, portable lamp. It provided enough light to read a map, a letter from home, or the settings on a rifle, all without giving away their position. One jar full of glowworms could provide a usable amount of light for hours, or even days. This wasn't an officially issued piece of equipment. It was a field expedient solution, a bit of battlefield improvisation born from necessity. It's the kind of small, clever detail that often gets lost in the grand histories of battles and campaigns. But for the individual soldier huddled in a foxhole on a moonless night, it was a vital tool. It gave them a small measure of control over the darkness that surrounded them. Pilots in the Royal Air Force also reportedly used them in their cockpits. The bright lights of the instrument panel could ruin a pilot's night vision, making it harder to spot enemy aircraft in the dark. A jar of glowworms, however, provided a soft glow that was just enough to read their instruments without compromising their ability to see outside the plane. It was a piece of living technology, harvested from the English countryside and taken into the heart of the air war. The light that was meant to create life, to attract a mate, was repurposed to help wage war. The unknowns are fascinating. Was there a particular time of year when glowworms were more plentiful and thus more useful? Did soldiers trade them or have lucky jars? We don't know if any official studies were ever done on the effectiveness of glowworm light, and what did the soldiers think about it? Was it just a tool, or did they feel a strange connection to these little creatures, these tiny sparks of life lighting up the darkest places of the war? Number 17, could a dead rat be a weapon? Espionage and sabotage are all about deception. The perfect weapon is one that is never noticed until it's too late. During the war, the British Special Operations Executive, or SOE, was tasked with creating all kinds of clever and deadly devices to be used by agents and resistance fighters in occupied Europe. One of their most bizarre and ingenious ideas was the rat bomb. The plan was not to use live rats. It was to use their dead bodies. Rats were everywhere in Europe. They were a common sight in factories, warehouses, and boiler rooms. A dead rat lying on a pile of coal would attract no attention at all. This was the key to the plan. SOE technicians would take dead rats, cut them open, and stuff them with plastic explosives. The detonator was a simple time delay fuse. The rat was then carefully stitched back up to look completely normal. The idea was for agents or resistance fighters to place these explosive stuffed rats in the coal piles next to the boilers in a factory or a locomotive. A worker shoveling coal into the furnace would unknowingly shovel the rat in, along with it. Once inside the intense heat of the boiler, the explosive would detonate, causing a catastrophic boiler explosion. This would shut down the factory or disable the train, all without a clear sign of sabotage. The explosion would be blamed on a faulty boiler. It was a brilliant piece of psychological warfare as well. Once the enemy discovered the plot, they would have to waste huge amounts of time and manpower checking every single dead rat. A large number of these prepared rats were created and packed for shipment to agents in the field. However, the first shipment was intercepted by the German authorities. The plan was exposed. The Germans were so impressed by the ingenuity of the device that they reportedly exhibited the captured rat bombs at their top military schools. They also began searching for other suspicious-looking dead rats, which is exactly the kind of time-wasting paranoia the SOE had hoped to create. Because the plot was foiled so early, it's believed that no rat bombs were ever successfully used to blow up a boiler. The plan was a failure in its primary mission, but it was a success in another way. It demonstrated the kind of thinking that was happening in the secret corners of the war. No idea was too strange or too macabre if it could give the Allies an edge. They were willing to weaponize anything, even the carcass of a common pest. Many questions remain about this strange episode. How did the SOE procure the hundreds of dead rats they needed? Were there official rat catchers on the payroll? Since the first batch was captured, were any others ever smuggled into Europe? And did the German discovery of the plot lead to any actual widespread rat hunts that disrupted their war effort? Or was the psychological impact just a footnote in a secret file? Number 16, did a chicken hold the key to a smarter bomb? This sounds like the beginning of a joke. A chicken, a missile, and one of the most famous psychologists of the 20th century. But it was a real top secret American military project during the war. It was called Project Pigeon, and its goal was to create a pigeon-guided missile. The man behind it was B.F. Skinner, a behavioral psychologist best known for his work on operant conditioning, often involving rats in a Skinner box. The problem with bombs and missiles at the time was guidance. Once a bomb was dropped, it was just following the laws of physics. Hitting a moving target like a ship was incredibly difficult. The military needed a way to guide a missile to its target after it was launched. Electronics were still in their infancy, so Skinner proposed a biological solution. He believed he could train pigeons to do the job. The idea was to place a pigeon inside the nose cone of a missile. In front of the pigeon was a screen that showed an image of the target projected through a lens at the front of the missile. The pigeon was trained to recognize the target, for example, the silhouette of a ship. It was then trained to peck at the center of that image on the screen. If the missile started to drift off course, the image of the ship would move off the center of the screen. The pigeon, trying to get its food reward, would follow the image, pecking at its new position. These pecks were the key. The screen was connected to the missile's flight controls. If the pigeon pecked to the right of center, it would adjust the missile's fins to turn it to the right. If it pecked high, the missile would go up. The pigeon was, in effect, the pilot. It was a living guidance system. Skinner demonstrated that pigeons were remarkably good at this. They could be trained to track targets reliably, even under the stress of simulated battlefield conditions like loud noises and pressure changes. He even trained them in groups of 3 to ensure a consensus and prevent one rogue pigeon from steering the missile astray. The military was skeptical, but they gave Skinner funding. The project, officially called Project Orcon for Organic Control, was developed. The prototypes worked, the pigeons did their job perfectly in lab simulations, but the idea of putting a bird in the nose cone of a missile was just too strange for the military leadership. As electronic guidance systems started to show more promise, funding for Project Pigeon was cut in 1944. The project was briefly revived in the 1950s, but ultimately abandoned for good. It remains one of the most eccentric weapon systems ever seriously considered. The unanswered questions are as strange as the project itself. How did Skinner and his team plan to keep the pigeons calm during the violent launch of a missile? What was the exact success rate of the pigeons in the later stages of testing? We also don't know if any high-ranking generals ever witnessed a live demonstration and what their immediate, unfiltered reactions were. And what happened to the flock of highly trained missile-piloting super pigeons after the project was finally canceled? Number 15. Why did a bear become a corporal? The story of Wojciech the bear is one of the most heartwarming and unbelievable tales of the entire war. He was not a mascot who stayed at a base. He was an officially enlisted soldier in the Polish II Corps, with his own paybook, rank, and serial number. He lived with the soldiers, traveled with them, and served alongside them in one of the war's toughest campaigns. His story began in 1942 in Iran. A group of Polish soldiers who had been released from Soviet captivity and were making their way to join the British forces came across a young boy who had found an orphaned Syrian brown bear cub. The soldiers took pity on the small creature, and one of them, Irina Bokiewicz, the niece of a Polish general, convinced the lieutenant to buy it. They named him Wojtek. The soldiers raised the cub, they fed him condensed milk from an old vodka bottle, and later, fruit, marmalade, and honey. As he grew, he became the unofficial mascot of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company. But he was more than a mascot. He was one of them. He would wrestle with the men, play fight, and learn to drink beer and smoke, or rather, eat cigarettes. He slept in a custom-built crate or often in the tents with the soldiers. He was a huge morale booster, a reminder of something innocent and good in a world of chaos and violence. When the Polish forces were scheduled to be deployed from Egypt to fight in the Italian campaign, there was a problem. The British authorities would not allow a wild animal onto the transport ship. The Polish commanders came up with a brilliant solution. They officially enlisted Wojtek into the Polish army. He was given the rank of private and a serial number. He was now Private Wojtek, a soldier of the 22nd Company. With his official papers, he was allowed to board the ship. In Italy, during the brutal Battle of Monte Cassino in 1944, Wojtek's legend was cemented. He saw the men carrying heavy crates of artillery shells. Being an intelligent bear who had spent his life imitating his human companions, he wanted to help. He would approach the trucks, stand on his hind legs, and hold out his front paws. The soldiers would place a 100-pound crate of shells in his arms, and he would carry it to the gun emplacements. He never dropped a single one. He worked tirelessly, carrying the heavy ammunition under fire, completely unafraid of the noise and explosions. In recognition of his service, the company headquarters approved a new official emblem for the 22nd Company, a silhouette of a bear carrying an artillery shell. After the war, the 22nd Company was demobilized in Scotland. Wojtek went with them. He became a local celebrity, but he could not stay with his friends forever. In 1947, he was moved to the Edinburgh Zoo. He lived there for the rest of his life, often visited by his old Polish comrades, who would speak to him in Polish and sometimes toss him cigarettes. He died in 1963. There are so many things we wish we knew. Did Wojtek truly understand what he was doing when he carried those shells, or was he just imitating his friends in a game? How did enemy soldiers react if they ever caught a glimpse of a bear working on the Allied front lines? We can only wonder about the deep emotional conversations his old comrades had with him at the zoo, sharing memories that only they and a bear could understand. And what was going through the bear's mind in his final years, a war hero living out his days in a cage. Number 14 were reindeer, a secret weapon in the snow? The war in the far north, on the border between Finland and the Soviet Union, was a different kind of conflict. It was fought in deep snow, thick forests, and sub-zero temperatures. Traditional military transport, like trucks and even horses, struggled in this environment. But for the native Sami people and the soldiers who learned from them, there was a perfect solution: the reindeer. Both the Finnish and Soviet armies used reindeer as pack and transport animals during the Winter War 1939 to 1940 and the subsequent conflicts. These animals were perfectly adapted to the Arctic conditions. Their wide hooves acted like snowshoes, allowing them to move easily through deep snow where men and horses would flounder. They were incredibly resilient to the cold, with a thick coat of hollow hairs that provided excellent insulation. They were used to pull sleds, known as akios, which were filled with supplies, ammunition, and even wounded soldiers. A single reindeer could pull a sled. Loaded with over 200 pounds, they could travel long distances through difficult terrain with very little food, surviving by digging through the snow to find lichen, their natural food source. This made them ideal for long-range patrols and for supplying troops in remote locations that were inaccessible to vehicles. Russian Soviet forces in particular created specialized reindeer transport battalions. They were used extensively in the defense of Murmansk, a critical port city. These units could move silently through the forests, making them perfect for surprise attacks and for evacuating the wounded without being detected. The reindeer were not just beasts of burden, they were a critical part of the logistical chain that allowed soldiers to fight and survive in one of the world's harshest environments. The Finns, with their deep knowledge of the land, used them for reconnaissance missions. A soldier on skis, pulled by a reindeer, could cover vast distances quickly and quietly. It was a form of warfare that was uniquely adapted to the Arctic, combining modern weapons with ancient survival techniques. The reindeer were the engines of this northern war, as vital to the soldiers there as the jeep was to soldiers in Western Europe. They were quiet, resilient, and perfectly suited to the job, but much about their service is lost to history. How many reindeer were officially conscripted into the Soviet and Finnish armies? We don't have exact numbers. Were there any specific reindeer that became famous among the troops for their strength or intelligence? Did the soldiers who worked with them develop the same kind of close bonds that cavalrymen had with their horses? And how did the mass use of these animals impact the traditional herding lifestyle of the indigenous Sami people who depended on the reindeer for their survival? Number 13, what was the war like for an elephant? In the jungles of Burma and Southeast Asia, the war against the Japanese forces was a logistical nightmare. There were few roads, dense vegetation, and monsoon rains that turned the ground into a sea of mud. Trucks were useless. Even mules struggled, but there was one animal that could handle the terrain: the elephant. Elephants had been used as work animals in this part of the world for centuries, particularly in the logging industry. The British Army, facing immense challenges in supplying their troops, turned to these beasts of war. They commandeered or hired elephants and their handlers, known as mahouts, to support the war effort. And companies like the Bombay-Burma Trading Corporation, which used elephants for logging, put their animals and expertise at the service of the military. These elephants were used primarily for engineering and transport. They could lift and carry massive logs to build bridges, clear roads, and pull trucks out of the mud. A single elephant could do the work of a whole platoon of men or a heavy-duty tractor, and it could go places no vehicle could ever reach. They were living all-terrain cranes and bulldozers. They ferried supplies, ammunition, and heavy equipment to the front lines, playing a crucial role in campaigns like the reconquest of Burma. One of the most famous figures associated with these elephants was a British officer named James Elephant Bill Williams. He worked for a timber company before the war and had a deep understanding of the animals. When the Japanese invaded Burma in 1942, he led a group of 53 elephants and their mahouts on a perilous journey over the mountains into India to escape capture, saving them for the Allied war effort. His book, Elephant Bill, details the incredible intelligence and personality of the animals he worked with. Life for the elephants was incredibly hard. They worked long hours in difficult conditions. They were also in the line of fire. They were targets for Japanese aircraft and patrols. Many were killed or injured. The bond between an elephant and its mahout is incredibly strong, and when an elephant was killed, the grief of its handler was profound. These were not just animals, they were partners. They were quiet, powerful, and indispensable soldiers in a forgotten theater of the war. We have stories like Elephant Bill's, but so much is still unknown. What was the total number of elephants that served with the Allied forces? We only have estimates. How did the Japanese army use elephants on their side of the conflict? Their use is less documented. What were the long-term psychological effects on the elephants who survived the trauma of the battlefield? And what happened to the unique relationship between the military and these working animals when the war was over and the machines came back? Number 12, how did a ship's cat earn a medal? Life on a warship was a mix of intense action and long periods of boredom. The crew lived in cramped, stressful conditions far from home. In these steel worlds, a small, furry creature could make a huge difference. For centuries, cats have been a standard part of a ship's crew. Their primary job was practical, to hunt the rats and mice that could chew through ropes, wires, and food supplies. But in the war, their role as morale boosters became just as important. One of the most famous ship's cats was Simon of HMS Amethyst. He was found as a half-starved kitten in a Hong Kong dockyard in 1948, just after the war. But his story is a perfect example of the role these animals played. He was adopted by a young seaman and quickly became a favorite of the crew, known for his skill at catching rats. His fame, however, came during the Yangtze incident, a tense standoff where the Amethyst was trapped on a Chinese river under fire. During the initial shelling, Simon was wounded by shrapnel. He was found on deck, burned and injured. The ship's medical officer performed surgery on him, and he was not expected to live. But Simon was tough. He not only survived, but as he recovered, he went back to work. He started catching rats again, which were threatening the ship's dwindling food supplies. More importantly, his presence was a huge comfort to the young, frightened sailors trapped on the damaged ship. His purring presence was a sign of resilience and normality in a terrifying situation. He was awarded the Dickin Medal, often called the Animal's Victoria Cross, for his service. The citation praised him for upholding the morale of the ship's company and for his rat-catching duties. During the war itself, many cats were famous. There was Unsinkable Sam, a cat who supposedly survived the sinking of 3 different ships: the German battleship Bismarck, the British destroyer HMS Cossack, and the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. While the details of his story are debated, it speaks to the powerful legends that grew up around these animals. Winston Churchill had his own ship's cat, Blackie, who was with him on many important voyages. These cats were more than just pets. They were a living, breathing part of the crew. They provided a touch of home, a moment of distraction from the constant fear. Stroking a cat could be a way for a sailor to ground himself, to connect with something soft and alive in a world of hard steel and sudden death. They did their job as pest controllers, but their most important role was an unofficial one. They were the ship's soul. What we don't know is the scale of their service. How many thousands of cats served on naval and merchant ships across all nations? What happened to them when their ships were sunk? We only know the stories of the few who survived. Were there official regulations regarding the keeping of cats on board, or was it an informal tradition? And how many sailors' lives were made just a little more bearable by the quiet companionship of a cat in the lonely watches of the night? Oh, number 11. Could a falcon fight a pigeon? Carrier pigeons were a vital communication tool during the war. They were fast, reliable, and couldn't be intercepted by electronic means. But they were not invulnerable. A pigeon flying over enemy territory was a target. Soldiers were trained to shoot them down. But the British came up with a more creative and natural solution to the problem of enemy pigeons. They fought birds with birds. They trained falcons to hunt and intercept the pigeons that were suspected of carrying messages for the enemy. This was a secret program run by the British intelligence service, MI5. They were concerned that the Germans were using pigeons to drop messages to spies operating in Britain. To counter this, they established a special falconry unit. The idea was to release trained peregrine falcons to patrol the skies over Britain. These birds of prey are natural pigeon hunters. They are among the fastest animals on the planet, capable of diving at speeds of over 200 miles per hour. A pigeon would have almost no chance of escape. The unit was led by a professional falconer. They trained the birds to recognize pigeons as prey and to bring them down. The falcons weren't trained to kill the pigeons, but to capture them and bring them back. That way, any message capsules attached to the pigeon's leg could be recovered and analyzed by intelligence officers. It was a form of biological air defense. The program had some success. The falcons did manage to bring down a couple of pigeons that were confirmed to be carrying messages from the German side. However, the program was not a resounding success. It was difficult to keep the falcons focused on only enemy pigeons. They would often attack British pigeons or other birds. Sometimes they would just fly off and not return. The falcons were wild animals and they couldn't be controlled with the same precision as a machine. The program was eventually scaled back. It was an ingenious idea, a throwback to the medieval sport of falconry, but it was ultimately not as effective as more conventional intelligence methods. Still, for a time, the skies over Britain were a battlefield for a secret war fought between pigeons and falcons, a strange and ancient conflict played out against the backdrop of modern warfare. It's a reminder that both sides were willing to try anything, no matter how unconventional, to gain an advantage. The full story of this falcon unit is still shrouded in secrecy. How many falcons were actually trained and deployed? No, we are not certain. What was the exact content of the messages they intercepted? Much of that intelligence remains classified. Did the German military ever become aware of the British Falcon program and try to develop countermeasures like flying their pigeons at night? And were there any other attempts by any nation to use birds of prey for military purposes during the conflict? Number 10. How much did the war depend on the horse? When we picture World War II, we see tanks, planes, and jeeps. It feels like a fully mechanized war. But that image is misleading. For many armies, the most important piece of transport technology was not the internal combustion engine. It was the horse. The scale of horse and mule use in the war was staggering, and it's a part of the story that is often forgotten. The German army, famous for its blitzkrieg tactics with tanks and dive bombers, was, in reality, heavily reliant on horses. Over the course of the war, the German military used more than 2.7 million horses and mules. The vast majority of their artillery and supply wagons were horse-drawn. For every one of their famous panzer divisions, there were many more infantry divisions that moved at the speed of a walking man and were supplied by horse. This was especially true on the Eastern Front, where the poor roads and harsh weather made trucks unreliable. The German war machine was powered as much by oats as it was by oil. The Soviet Union also used millions of horses. Their famous Cossack cavalry units were still a feature of the Red Army, and they were used for reconnaissance and flanking maneuvers. Like the Germans, much of their supply chain depended on horse-drawn carts. In the vast spaces of Russia, the horse was often more reliable than the machine. The United States Army was more mechanized, but it also used horses and mules, particularly in difficult terrain. The campaign in Italy, with its steep, rugged mountains, was a perfect example. The U.S. Army's 10th Mountain Division used mules extensively to carry supplies and equipment up paths that no vehicle could manage. These mules were tough, sure-footed, and essential to keeping the soldiers on the front line supplied. These animals shared all the dangers of the soldiers. They were shelled, bombed, and shot. They suffered from disease, exhaustion, and starvation. The losses were immense. Millions of horses died in the conflict. They were the unsung, silent victims of the war. To make the difference in their contribution was not glamorous, but without them, the war especially on the Eastern Front, could not have been fought on the scale that it was. It was the last great horse-powered war in history, but the details are still hazy. What was the exact number of horses and mules that died in the conflict? The estimates vary wildly. How did the mass conscription of farm horses impact food production back in the home countries? We know it had an effect, but the scale is hard to measure. What happened to the veterinary corps that had to treat these millions of animals under battlefield conditions? Their stories are rarely told. And was there a moment when military planners realized that the age of the horse was truly over, and the future of war was entirely mechanical? Number 9 were camels, the ships of the Desert War. The war in North Africa was a war of movement. Vast, empty deserts, scorching heat, and a constant struggle for water and fuel. Tanks and trucks were the stars of this campaign, but they were not the only form of transport. In some areas, and for some specialized units, the military turned to an animal that had mastered the desert thousands of years before the camel. Several Allied units, particularly those operating in more remote areas or on long-range reconnaissance missions, used camels. The British long-range desert group Lurgi, famous for their daring raids deep behind enemy lines, experimented with them. While they are best known for their modified Chevrolet trucks, they understood that in some situations a camel had advantages. A camel can travel for days without water, it can carry heavy loads over soft sand where a truck would get stuck, and, most importantly, it is silent. A patrol on camelback could move with a stealth that was impossible for a convoy of noisy trucks. The French also used camel corps units, known as Marist, in their colonial territories in Africa. These units were composed of local soldiers who were expert camel handlers, and they were used for patrols and to maintain security in remote desert regions that were part of the wider conflict. The use of camels was not widespread, but it was significant for these specialized forces. They were used as pack animals to carry water, fuel, and supplies to secret observation posts or hidden bases. They were a living, breathing part of the logistics chain in a place that was hostile to both man and machine. They were a link to an older form of desert warfare, a tradition that stretched back for centuries. The sight of a British soldier in shorts and a sun helmet leading a string of camels loaded with jerry cans of petrol is a perfect image of how old and new ways of war collided in the desert. Their contribution was small but vital. They allowed small units to operate with a degree of freedom and stealth that would have been otherwise impossible. They were a symbol of adaptation, of using the resources and knowledge of the local environment to gain a military edge. They were the original all-terrain vehicles. The history of these camel units is not well documented. How many camels were used by Allied forces in total? The numbers are very unclear. Were there any direct combat encounters where camel-mounted troops were involved? Stories exist, but official records are scarce. We also don't know how the Axis forces, particularly the Italians in Libya, used camels in their own operations. And what was the relationship between the European soldiers and the local handlers who taught them the ancient art of managing these desert animals? Number 8. How did a dog become a prisoner of war? Dogs served in World War II in dozens of different roles. They were sentries, messengers, scouts, and bomb detectors. They laid telephone wires and located wounded soldiers. But the story of Judy, a purebred English pointer, is unique. She was the only animal to be officially registered as a prisoner of war. Judy was the ship's mascot on the British gunboat HMS Knot and later HMS Grasshopper. She was known for her incredible hearing and her ability to warn the crew of approaching enemy aircraft long before the human lookouts could spot them. When the Grasshopper was sunk in 1942, Judy was among the survivors who made it to an uninhabited island. She proved her worth there, finding a source of fresh water that saved the men's lives. After a long journey, the survivors were captured by the Japanese and sent to a prison camp in Sumatra. Judy went with them. The camp commandant was cruel and the prisoners were treated brutally, but Judy was a source of hope. She would bark and distract the guards when they were beating the prisoners, drawing their anger to herself. She hunted snakes and rats in the camp, providing a small source of extra food for the starving men. Her main human companion in the camp was a man named Frank Williams. He saw that the guards intended to kill the dog. To save her, he made a bold move. He somehow convinced the camp commandant, who was often drunk, to register Judy as an official prisoner of war. By giving her the status of a prisoner, he hoped to offer her some protection. Miraculously, the commandant agreed. Judy became POW 81A Glorgor Medan. She survived the war, enduring multiple prison camps and another sinking when the prisoners were being transported on a different ship. After the war, she was smuggled back to Britain with Frank Williams. She was awarded the Dickin Medal. Her citation reads, "For magnificent courage and endurance in Japanese prison camps, which helped to maintain morale among her fellow prisoners, and for saving many lives through her intelligence and watchfulness." She lived out her life with Williams and was buried with a plaque detailing her incredible service. Her story is a powerful testament to the bond between a man and a dog in the worst imaginable circumstances. Judy's story is well documented, but it raises other questions. Were there other animals who were unofficially prisoners alongside the soldiers, whose stories were never told? We will likely never know. How did the act of officially registering a dog as a POW affect the camp's bureaucracy and the Japanese guards' perception of her? It's a psychological puzzle. We also wonder about the countless other camp animals, the cats, dogs, and monkeys that prisoners adopted, who provided comfort but whose names are lost to history. And what did Judy's presence mean to the other prisoners who had lost everything? Number 7. Could a bat bomb have ended the war? This is perhaps the most audacious and bizarre weapon plan of the entire war. It came from the mind of a dental surgeon from Pennsylvania named Lytle S. Adams. His idea was to use millions of bats, each carrying a tiny incendiary bomb, to attack Japanese cities. The project was approved by President Roosevelt himself and taken very seriously by the military. The concept was based on a few key facts. First, Japanese cities were largely built from wood and paper, making them highly vulnerable to fire. Second, bats are nocturnal. They roost in dark, hidden places during the day. Third, there are huge populations of bats in the United States, particularly the Mexican free-tailed bat. The plan was a special bomb casing would be developed that could hold over 1,000 bats. Each bat would have a small 17-gram napalm-based incendiary bomb attached to its body with a surgical clip. A time delay fuse was part of the device. The bomb casing carrying the bats would be dropped from a high-altitude bomber over a target city. A parachute would deploy, and as the bomb descended, the casing would open, releasing the bats. The bats, now awake and disoriented, would do what bats do. They would fly off and find places to hide for the day. They would crawl into the eaves of buildings, into attics, and into the dark spaces inside factories and warehouses. After a set amount of time, the fuses on their tiny bombs would go off, starting thousands of fires simultaneously all across a wide area. The resulting chaos would be impossible for firefighters to control. It was a plan to create an unstoppable firestorm. The project was given the codename X-Ray. The military spent millions of dollars developing it. They had to solve a number of technical problems. How do you handle and transport millions of bats? They found they could hibernate them by cooling them down. How do you design a tiny, reliable, incendiary bomb that a bat can carry? They developed several prototypes. The testing phase had some spectacular and sometimes disastrous results. During one test at a military airfield in New Mexico, some of the armed bats escaped accidentally. They flew to the nearest buildings, which happened to be a hangar and a general's car, and roosted. The bombs went off, and both the hangar and the car were burned to the ground. The project was a success, in a way. It proved the concept worked. Ultimately, the project was overtaken by another, much more powerful secret weapon, the atomic bomb. The Bat Bomb project was canceled in 1944. It was deemed too slow to develop and deploy compared to the new weapon. But for a time, the United States was seriously pursuing a plan to win the war with an army of fire-starting bats. The questions that remain are incredible. What would have been the psychological impact on the Japanese population of an attack by millions of burning bats? How close did the project actually come to being deployed in combat? Some sources say it was nearly ready. We also don't know the full ecological impact of capturing millions of bats from their caves for the war effort. And what other, even stranger, biological weapon ideas were considered and rejected in the secret labs of the war? Number 6, what was the true price of a message? The carrier pigeon was one of the oldest forms of communication, but in World War II, it was still one of the most reliable. Radio could be intercepted, telephone lines could be cut, human messengers could be captured, but a pigeon was small, fast, and flew high above the battlefield. It had a remarkable homing instinct and could travel hundreds of miles over unfamiliar territory to deliver its message. All sides used pigeons extensively. The British alone used around 250,000 birds during the war. They were dropped by parachute in cages behind enemy lines for resistance fighters to use. They were carried on bombers and reconnaissance planes. If a plane went down, the crew could release the pigeon with their location, and it would fly back to its home loft, bringing the first news of the crash. They were used by commando units and spies. The messages they carried were written on tiny pieces of rice paper and placed in a small canister attached to the bird's leg. These were not ordinary pigeons. They were specially bred and trained for speed, endurance, and homing ability. Their service was incredibly dangerous. A pigeon flying over enemy territory was an obvious target. It was a race against death. The birds had to face enemy soldiers, birds of prey, and terrible weather. The casualty rates were high. Many pigeons became heroes. 32 pigeons were awarded the Dickin Medal for their bravery. One of the most famous was an American pigeon named G.I. Joe. In 1943, during the Italian campaign, British forces were scheduled to bomb the Italian town of Colvivecchia. But American troops had captured the town ahead of schedule. All attempts to call off the air raid by radio failed. As the bombers were taking off, they released G.I. Joe with a message to cancel the attack. He flew 20 miles in 20 minutes, an incredible speed, and arrived just as the planes were preparing to bomb. He is credited with saving the lives of over 100 British soldiers and countless Italian civilians. Another hero was a British pigeon named Mary of Exeter. She was used for top-secret missions. She was wounded multiple times. She was attacked by German-trained hawks. She was shot and had to have stitches. Each time, she recovered and flew again. Her resilience was legendary. These birds were not just tools, they were soldiers. They had courage and determination. They flew through storms of steel to deliver their messages, and the information they carried saved thousands of lives. We know the stories of the heroes, but what about the rest? What was the overall survival rate for pigeons dropped behind enemy lines? The numbers are hard to confirm. How were the vast pigeon lofts on the home front managed and protected from spies and saboteurs? It was a major logistical operation. We also don't know the full story of the German pigeon program and whether they had heroes equivalent to G.I. Joe or Mary. And what was the emotional toll on the pigeon handlers, the men who raised and cared for these birds, when they sent them out on a dangerous mission, knowing many would never return? Number 5, were donkeys the unsung heroes of the mountains? In the rugged, mountainous terrain of Italy and Greece, the modern mechanized armies of World War II often found themselves defeated by a simple problem: gravity. Trucks and tanks could not climb the steep, narrow mule tracks that often served as the only roads. This is where the ancient partnership between soldier and beast of burden became critical once again. Alongside mules, the humble donkey played a vital, if unglamorous, role. Donkeys and their hybrid offspring, mules, were the perfect mountain transport. They are incredibly sure-footed, able to navigate treacherous paths with heavy loads. They are hardy, resilient, and can survive on less food and water than a horse. They were used by all armies operating in these regions: the Americans, British, Germans, Italians, and the Greek and Yugoslav partisans. They were the backbone of the mountain supply chain. They carried everything a soldier needed to fight and survive. They hauled crates of ammunition, heavy machine guns, mortars, food, water, and medical supplies up the mountains to the front lines. On the return journey, they often carried the wounded carefully strapped to special litters. A train of donkeys, patiently plodding up a steep hillside, was a common and essential sight. The sound of their braying echoed through the same valleys as the sound of artillery. The partisans, in particular, relied heavily on donkeys. Operating as guerrilla forces in the mountains of Greece and Yugoslavia, they had no access to military vehicles. Their entire war effort, their ability to move, fight, and survive, depended on these animals. A partisan unit's strength could be measured not just by its number of rifles, but by its number of donkeys. Life was incredibly difficult for these animals. They were often overloaded and worked to the point of exhaustion. They were exposed to the same dangers as the soldiers. They were killed by mortar fire, landmines, and machine guns. They suffered terribly, but their work was absolutely essential. Without them, the war in the mountains would have ground to a halt. The soldiers who worked with them developed a deep respect and affection for these stubborn, hard-working animals. They were comrades in arms, sharing the same hardships and facing the same enemy. The historical record on these animals is thin. We have no real idea how many thousands of donkeys and mules were used in the Italian and Balkan campaigns. Their casualties were never officially counted. We don't know how the armies procured them, were they bought, rented, or simply confiscated from local farmers. And what happened to the survivors after the armies moved on? Were they returned to their owners or simply abandoned? Their story is one of silent, patient endurance, a story written on the forgotten mountain paths of the war. Number four, did a dog's bark change the course of a battle? Dogs have been the companions of soldiers for thousands of years. In World War II, their use was formalized and expanded like never before. The United States created the Dogs for Defense program, which recruited pet dogs from American families to be trained for military service. These dogs served in many roles, but one of the most important was as a sentry. A sentry dog's job was to use its superior senses of hearing and smell to detect the enemy long before a human could. They would work with a handler, usually on patrol or guarding a perimeter at night. The dog was trained not to bark, which would give away their position. Instead, it would give a silent signal like a low growl, a stiffening of its body, or the raising of its hackles. The handler would then know that danger was near. One of the most famous war dogs was a Doberman Pinscher named Chips. He was a sentry dog who served in North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. His most famous moment came during the invasion of Sicily in 1943. Chips and his handler were pinned down on a beach by a hidden Italian machine gun nest. Suddenly, Chips broke free from his handler and charged the pillbox. The soldiers inside were so surprised by the attacking dog that they came out to surrender. Chips had single-handedly captured the position. In the process, he suffered a scalp wound and powder burns. He was unofficially awarded the Silver Star and the Purple Heart, though these were later revoked because military policy did not allow for animals to be decorated. Another hero was a German shepherd named Caesar, who served with the U.S. Marines in the Pacific. He was a messenger dog. During the Bougainville campaign, he successfully carried a message through intense enemy fire after 2 other human runners had been killed trying. He completed 9 successful runs before he was killed in action while trying to deliver his 10th message. These stories are just a few of thousands. Sentry dogs saved countless lives by giving early warnings of ambushes and surprise attacks. Messenger dogs carried vital information when all other forms of communication had failed. Casualty dogs were trained to find wounded soldiers on the battlefield, carrying medical supplies with them. They could find men who were unconscious or hidden in the undergrowth, men who would have otherwise been left to die. The contribution of these dogs was immense. They were loyal, brave, and they asked for nothing in return but the affection of their handlers. But what about the dogs we don't know about? How many secret patrols were saved from ambush by the silent warning of a dog? These events were never recorded. What was the psychological effect on a soldier of having a dog by his side in the terrifying loneliness of a nighttime foxhole? We also don't fully understand the experience of the dogs themselves. How did they cope with the constant stress and noise of the battlefield? And what happened to the thousands of dogs who survived the war? Some returned to their original families, but many had to be deprogrammed or were too changed by their experiences to be pets again. Number 3 was the sea lion, the first underwater spy. The oceans of World War II were a deadly place. Mines, submarines, and saboteurs posed a constant threat to ships and harbors. The military was always looking for new ways to detect these underwater dangers. Decades before the U.S. Navy's famous dolphin and sea lion programs of the Cold War, researchers were already exploring the idea of using marine mammals for military purposes. The research was highly experimental and shrouded in secrecy. The British were particularly interested in the idea. They knew that sea lions possessed abilities that far surpassed any human technology of the day. A sea lion has incredible underwater vision, especially in low light. It can dive to great depths, and it is a fast, agile swimmer. The key question was whether this natural talent could be harnessed for military tasks. The main idea was to train sea lions to locate mines or enemy divers. A sea lion could be trained to search a specific area, like a harbor entrance. If it found a mine, it could be taught to release a buoy to mark the location. If it found an enemy frogman trying to attach a limpet mine to a ship's hull, it could be trained to alert a guard on the surface. Some even considered a more aggressive role training the sea lions to carry a device to attach to a mine, or even to directly attack an enemy diver. This research was in its infancy. It was led by scientists who were experts in animal behavior. They conducted experiments in pools and in sheltered coastal waters. They had some success in teaching the animals basic tasks. They proved that a sea lion could be trained to identify and mark specific underwater objects. However, the challenge of controlling the animals in the open ocean was immense. A sea lion is a wild animal. Once released, there was no guarantee it would complete its mission or even return. The technology for tracking and communicating with the animals underwater did not yet exist. The project was ultimately deemed too unreliable and too difficult to implement on a large scale during the wartime emergency. The focus shifted to more conventional methods of mine detection, like sonar and minesweeping ships. But the idea was planted. The early secret experiments of World War II laid the groundwork for the much larger and more sophisticated marine mammal programs that would follow in the decades after the war. The full extent of this wartime research is still unknown. Many of the records were either destroyed or remain classified. Who were the key scientists involved in these programs? We only know a few names. Did the German or Japanese navies conduct any similar research with seals or dolphins? It's possible, but evidence is scarce. We also don't know the fate of the first group of military sea lions. What happened to them after the experiments were concluded? They were the secret aquatic pioneers of a new kind of warfare. Number 2, did a cat's purr keep the bombers flying? The strategic bombing campaign was a central part of the Allied war effort. Huge fleets of bombers flew deep into enemy territory. The survival of these planes and their crews depended on everything working perfectly. But these were complex machines, and they were constantly being damaged by anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. Back at the air bases in Britain, the ground crews worked around the clock to repair the damaged planes and get them ready for the next mission. These air bases were sprawling, busy places, and like any large settlement, they had a problem with rats and mice. The rodents would get into the food stores. More dangerously, they could chew through the electrical wiring of the bombers, causing catastrophic failures in the air. To combat this problem, many airbases adopted a simple, ancient solution. They got cats. Squadrons and maintenance units would adopt stray cats or bring them in from local animal shelters. These hangar cats had a vital job to do. They patrolled the hangars, the workshops, and the planes themselves, hunting the rodents that posed a threat to the war effort. They were an essential part of the base's pest control system. A bomber that was saved from a wiring fire by a cat was just as valuable as one that was saved from an enemy fighter by its gunners. But their role went far beyond pest control. Like the ship's cats, these hangar cats became a huge source of comfort and morale for the ground crews and the airmen. The air crews in particular lived under unimaginable stress. The chances of completing a full tour of 30 missions were terrifyingly low. Every flight could be their last. In this high-stakes environment, a cat was a connection to a normal, peaceful life. Petting a cat, hearing it purr, watching it play, these simple things could provide a moment of calm and release in a world defined by fear and noise. Many crews adopted their own cat as a squadron mascot. The cat would greet them when they returned from a mission and wait for them when they were gone. The presence of these animals made the cold, impersonal world of a military airbase feel a little more like home. They were a reminder of what the men were fighting for. Their quiet, unassuming service, both as hunters and as companions, was a small but important part of the vast machinery of the air war. The stories of these cats are mostly lost, passed down as anecdotes rather than official history. We have no idea how many cats served on Royal Air Force and U.S. Army Air Forces bases. We don't know if any specific cat was ever officially credited with saving an aircraft by preventing rodent damage. Did crews ever sneak their mascot cat onto a bombing mission for good luck? It's against the rules, but it almost certainly happened. And what did the cats themselves make of the constant roar of the bomber engines, the soundtrack to their unique war service? Number 1, what did a soldier owe to his friend? Of all the surprising roles animals played in the war, perhaps the most important and the most overlooked was that of a friend. In the midst of the chaos, violence, and loneliness of war, the bond between a soldier and an animal could be a lifeline. These were not military-trained animals with a specific job. They were strays, orphans, and mascots who provided comfort, companionship, and a reason to keep going. Across every front, soldiers adopted dogs, cats, monkeys, birds, and all manner of other creatures. A puppy found in the rubble of a bombed-out city could become the focus of a whole platoon's affection. A kitten adopted by a tank crew could provide a moment of gentle distraction from the grim reality of their work. These animals lived with the soldiers, ate their rations, and slept in their foxholes and bunks. One famous example was a small Yorkshire Terrier named Smokey. She was found in an abandoned foxhole in the New Guinea jungle by an American soldier. She became the mascot of a U.S. Army Air Force's photo reconnaissance squadron. She flew on missions, had her own parachute, and survived typhoons in combat, but her most important role was as a therapy dog. She would visit wounded soldiers in the hospital, and her cheerful presence is credited with lifting the spirits of countless injured men. She is considered by many to be the first therapy dog on record. The bond was a two-way street. The soldiers gave the animals food, shelter, and safety. The animals gave the soldiers something far more valuable: unconditional love. In a world where human life was cheap, the life of their animal companion was precious. It was something they could protect and care for. This act of nurturing, of being responsible for another living creature, helped them hold on to their own humanity. The animal did not care about rank, nationality, or the politics of the war. It just saw a human who needed a friend. This role is impossible to quantify. You cannot measure the morale boost provided by a purring cat or a wagging tail in a statistical report. But for the individual soldier, it could be the difference between hope and despair. The animal was a living, breathing piece of sanity in an insane world. It was a connection to a life of peace, a promise that such a world still existed and was worth fighting for. The greatest service these animals provided was simply being there. So many fundamental questions remain unanswered. How many soldiers' lives were saved from suicide or mental breakdown by the quiet companionship of an animal? It's a number we can never know. What was the unspoken policy of military commanders towards these unofficial mascots? Most seem to turn a blind eye, understanding their importance. How did the experience of caring for an animal in a war zone change the soldiers who did it? And in the end, when the war was over and the soldiers went home, what happened to the millions of animal friends they had to leave behind? That is perhaps the most heartbreaking question of all.